Let's get down to Nigeria's MPC decisions today with our panel. Let's start here from Lagos, the home of Channels Television. Pabina Ayinkere is live here in the studios with us. He's the head of institutional sales at Vertiva Capital Management. Good afternoon. It's good to have you here.
Thanks for having me, boss.
Thank you very much. And also sitting here in the studio at this time, Tajuddin Ibrahim, who is the head of research at Chapel Hill, Denham. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for
We got more members joining us here in Lagos and Abuja within the hour between now and 3 o'clock. Let's get started, gentlemen. And of course, let's go back and roll back all the way to July 26, 2016, when the central bank decided, or when the MPC decided, that the policy rate should be raised by 200 basis points. That was massive for a single meeting, and everybody felt, wow, and we were to 14%, and that has been unchanged since then. What were the arguments back then, in your view, as far as raising rates was concerned, if we have the same or the opposite of that argument to lower rates at this point? Let's start with you, Tajuddin.
Well, the arguments start largely from FX. So we began to have, so the first that we saw was a devaluation of the Naira in June. And so with that, the CBN was looking for stability in the FX market. So one way to get stability in the FX market is to, a great extent, reduce speculative demand for the US dollars in the financial market. So there was a need for the Naira to be costlier to get. So that is on the one hand. On the second hand, there was also a need for them to start to mop up liquidity from this financial system. And to mop up liquidity from the system, you need to attract investors or players in that market with high interest rates. And probably the third factor that they considered was high inflation. So we began to see inflationary pressure. So there was a need for them to raise interest rates, just so that, if there's any demand-pushed inflation can moderate on the back of high interest rates.
Pabina, let's, what do you think? June 2016 we were right at the middle of a blistering recession, in the manner of speaking. So this decision way back a little over a year ago by the central bank, do you think that was appropriate at that point in time?
Yes, it was appropriate. Like Tajuddin had explained, we're facing a very, very dire economic situation at that time. We're smack in the middle of a currency crisis. Inflation was beginning to race, and no one knew where it was going to end. So at that time, it was the right call. The benefit of hindsight can make us see that. Coming into this meeting, one would expect that it might still be the same position. To keep rates on hold. We still think the economy is gradually coming out of recession, but it's still very fragile. The recovery is still very fragile. So I think acting now in any other direction besides a hold will be counterproductive.
Thank you for your thoughts, gentlemen. Early thoughts here on the discussion today. Let's cross over to Abuja. Abuja is where the headquarters of the Central Bank of Nigeria is. And of course, we've got Channels Television studios there as well. And joining us live from Abuja on this discussion all the way to 3 o'clock is Ogo Okiti, economist and chief executive officer at Time Economics. Good afternoon, and thanks for being part of the discussion today.
Good afternoon, boss, and thanks for having me.
We appreciate that. So take us back to July 2016, 26th of July to be precise, when the rates were raised from 12% to 14%. Looking back, do you think those arguments actually hold water back then? And do you think right now we have a basis for a reversal?
Yeah, thank you. July 2016, there were three critical economic situations at that time. The first was that we had just experienced the first negative growth definitely over a decade. And it's also possible at that time that the Central Bank of Nigeria was already aware that we're going to go into a recession. So on the growth side, we were already in a bad shape. That's the first thing. The second thing was that on the inflation side also, we were having high and rapidly rising rates of inflation. And I'm sure the Central Bank of Nigeria also thought that at that time they needed to do something about the inflation. But the third aspect also was that the external economic environment was very, very poor. We have very, very poor balance of payment situation, and the exchange rate was also very, very volatile, you know, and there was an increasing divergence between the official rate at that time and the parallel market rates. So if you look at these three key parameters for Nigeria on growth, on inflation, and of course on the external economic environment front, I think the Central Bank of Nigeria thought that it was best to increase interest rate at that time to try and send a message that is very, very keen on nipping inflation in its bud. However, a year after, I think the circumstances have slightly changed. We still have a number of issues. If you look today now, if you look at the growth, yes, we have just recorded 0.6% for the second quarter of 2017, but it is still very, very weak. That's on growth. On inflation, you can say that inflation is coming down, but if you actually interrogate the data very well, you will notice that inflation is actually not really coming down. What we have seen is that 2017 is reflecting the base effect of 2016. That's on one part. On another part, food inflation for the past 18 months has actually been rising, even in the midst of this falling inflation. The little progress we have made on the inflation front can be attributed solely to the stability in the exchange rate market. So the inflation, on the inflation aspect, it is also still very weak. Okay, now, if you now look at the banking system as well, that is also not very, very strong at the moment. So if you look, why the situation in 2017 is slightly better than the situation we had in 2016, it is still not something I would call a situation for us to really clap for ourselves that we are really coming out of the worst economic crisis in over 2 decades.